my habit when I read the scriptures in a service to do a little bit of background information before I read it. But since you were all standing, I thought, I'm not going to make you stand there while I do this. So you're going to get it as kind of a prelude to the sermon. When we follow the lectionary, as Pastor Rob does and as I usually do, we get into a little bit of a problem, specifically at this time on these two Sundays, because the reading last Sunday about Joseph and his dream and the warning to go to Egypt actually is the very next verses after the ones we read this morning. And last Sunday's gospel lesson began with the phrase, I believe it is phrased this way, and after they had departed. Well, the they is the Magi. And so the story last week about what Herod actually did, the slaughtering of the innocents, the killing of the male children under 2 years of age, actually would come immediately after the wise people that we read about this morning had departed by another road, showing just how wise they were not to go back to Herod. So sometimes knowing the context of a passage of Scripture makes a huge amount of difference in how you read and understand it. So, having said all that, this is the sermon as it was supposed to begin. Have you ever noticed that you perk up and listen a little more closely when it's a Bible story that is being read from the lectern or the pulpit than you do when you're hearing a passage from one of Paul's letters to one of the early churches that he nurtured? Both Barbara, who is the pastor at Evangelical Reformed, and I skipped the epistle lesson this morning. Well, today's gospel is a narrative. It's a Bible story. And it begins with the phrase, in the time of King Herod, which gives it a feel of historical authority. A lot of our stories in Scripture don't have an actual time setting. Jesus' parables were never told in a specific time settings. But this one is, and the first century Jews and Christians who heard that phrase, in the time of King Herod, it would have been meaningful to them. It would have given them a real sense of foreboding upon hearing those words, because they would have remembered that Herod had been a vicious ruler, obsessed with maintaining his power. There are no documents outside of the Bible that really speak about a slaughter of innocents by Herod, but there are documentations of things that he did that were almost as bad. It would have signaled to those first people who heard or read the Gospel of Matthew that things were not going to go well for this child of ancient Jewish lineage who had been born to Mary and Joseph. Then there are other stories that begin with the phrase, once upon a time. And when you hear once upon a time, you think fairy tale. You think myth. And that does not mean that the story is not true, but rather it means that the truth of it must be discerned more from the heart than from the head. And sometimes stories that start out in time, in specific chronological time, become once upon a time stories because we realize that the lesson to be learned just keeps reoccurring, and it's no longer about a specific time, but about life. Once upon a time stories suggest the story has a meaning beyond time, and that is the kind of story I want to share with you this morning, even though it's going to sound remarkably like the "in the time of Herod" story that was read. And it's not even going to start with the phrase "once upon a time," because I'm going to tell it in the first person, as if I were one of the Magi, and that that visitor is here this morning telling the story, and thank you, Carol, from her perspective. I need to ask you to look and listen in a way that goes beyond your physical eyes and ears. I need you to see and hear another person, one who journeyed a great distance in search of royalty, and on that journey encountered two very different types of kings. So take a moment, maybe close your eyes until you hear my voice again, and then listen as if one of the Magi, one of the wise ones, was here before you. My colleagues and I started out on our journey when we saw the star rise in the east. We were astronomers, scientists of the day who studied the heavens. And we studied the heavens because the stars were really one of the best ways to navigate in the desert and on the seas where there were no roads that the Roman government had built as a means of moving its troops more quickly. But we also believe that the heavens could provide signs from the gods of new kings being born. And so that is what we believed we saw when we saw the star rising in the east. You've heard stories about us. You've heard there were 3 of us. You've heard that we were kings or magicians. And let me tell you, the word magician is not a compliment to someone who understands themselves to be a scholar and one who does good by studying the heavens in order to map out the stars so that others can be guided by them on their journeys. And And it was a respectable, it was a good profession to have because the world was expanding, commerce was becoming more common, and there were more travelers, more merchants who needed to follow the stars, not to find a king, but to get to where their business or their interests might take them. And I'm not going to quibble over the word magician because actually who we were is not the point of this story. We followed the star, traveling west from Persia, which is where we were astronomers. Some say we were Zoroastrian priests. Well, we thought of ourselves as scientists, scholars. And we knew that ancient Jewish scriptures made references to other nations coming to Jerusalem, coming to Zion. But that wasn't really what we were thinking of at first when we left and began to follow the star, because we followed stars. But after many weeks of traveling, suddenly we couldn't see the star anymore. And then we remembered that maybe the people in the city of Jerusalem would know where this new king had been born. And so we decided to go to the palace of King Herod for guidance. Now, Herod was called the king of the Jews, but not because he had any real authority of his own. He had his position at the pleasure of the Roman emperor, because indeed it was Rome that ruled all of that part of the world at the time. We knew that about him, and since he was king of the Jews, we thought, well, he would know about the prophecies. He would be able to tell us where we might find this new king. Unfortunately, we did not know about Herod's wicked nature. We didn't know about his fear of losing power. But I get ahead of myself. Herod warned us. Herod greeted us warmly. You see, hospitality is very important in our part of the world, the deserts. Hospitality can be a matter of life and death if people offer it or do not. And so he greeted us, but it was immediately clear that he really didn't know anything about the prophetic announcements of the king or what the prophets had written about. And so he had to turn to others in his court, the leaders of the temple, the scribes who knew the scriptures. And they, of course, interpreted them and sent us on our way towards a town called Bethlehem. We felt when we started out again that we were really on the right path because we could see the star again. But then it became clear that it was just leading off south of the city into the mountains. What king was going to be located there? But we followed the star, and suddenly it stopped to rest. But it was over a small house, a very simple house. And the thing about it was, it seemed as if the radiance from the star above also came from the house beneath, as simple as it was. Herod's palace had radiated a wealth, and it was surrounded by guards who were needed to keep him in power. But this was a different kind of radiance. The radiance at Herod's palace was like a sheen of gold to hide the evil. The radiance of this simple house was like the radiance that reveals good rather than concealing evil. We entered the house, bringing our gifts that were fit for a king, and what we saw was a mother and a child who radiated light and hope and grace and glory. We still presented our gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, fit for a king, but I'm not sure they were really worth much to that king. We were not wise in trusting Herod, in going to Herod and expecting him to give us sound advice. We were not wise when we said, oh yes, we will come back and tell you exactly where the babe is laying. We were, however, wise enough that we paid attention to a dream that we had. In the dream, we were told to go home by another route. We did know enough about the Hebrew scriptures to know that the God of Israel often spoke in dreams. And so we paid attention. We went back by another route. But it wasn't so much about the other geographical route that we took going home. It was really about the way we were changed. No, we brought gifts to the baby, but what we got was the best gift. We had come on our journey, starting out as learned people who trusted in our own wisdom, people who were susceptible to the temptations of power and wealth. But we learned in our encounter with Herod that sometimes having that power and wealth makes one so committed to it, so fearful of losing it, that they've really become a prisoner to it. We, on the other hand, experience the life-giving power of a child who was filled with grace and glory and truth and light. We had received that gift, not in a time when things were going pretty smoothly in the world, but in a time when we needed it the most, in a dangerous